Blood stained the collar around its neck, and still it ran through the smoke, the gunfire, the betrayal. In the chaos of broken flags and shattered oaths, one figure refused to fall, weaving between fallen soldiers and burning ruins, carrying not just survival, but a secret too dangerous to bury. They thought they had silenced everything. They thought no one would ever remember. They were wrong. The ceremony was never about honor. The coffin was never meant for a hero. And now, something that was never supposed to survive is coming back for the truth they tried so hard to erase. But who is he? And what does he carry that could tear down an empire built on lies? If you felt even a flicker of something while watching this, stay with us, hit like, subscribe, and tell me down below where you tuning in from, and what moment made you hold your breath. I'm reading every word. This story isn't finished yet, and neither are you. The sun barely breached the steel-colored sky, casting the funeral grounds in a muted haze. A chill wind coursed through the gathering of stiff uniforms and somber faces, fluttering the flags positioned neatly along the aisle. Rows upon rows of soldiers, both active and retired, filled the space between the wrought iron gates and the old oak standing sentinel over the memorial grounds. Every boot stood at attention, every metal gleamed dully against polished chests. In the very center, atop a polished marble pedestal, rested the dark mahogany casket draped with an immaculate American flag, bordered in blue and white, heavy with symbolism and loss. A deep, measured voice from the chaplain rose into the morning air, but it barely disturbed the unnatural stillness pressing down on the attendees. They were here to honor Orion, a war dog whose exploits on foreign battlefields had become whispered legend within elite military circles. The dog that had sniffed out traps when human senses failed. The dog that had thrown himself between his handler and death more than once. The dog that just weeks ago had been declared lost in action under circumstances so classified even the highest-ranking generals seemed reluctant to meet each other's eyes when discussing it. Today was meant to give closure, and yet, beneath the crispness of ceremony, an uneasy current rippled, subtle but relentless. As Major Carlyle stepped forward to deliver Orion's eulogy, the pallbearers moved stiffly, lifting the casket to carry it toward the ceremonial platform. As they did, something odd happened. The first to grasp the handles, Sergeant Reed, furrowed his brow. He shifted his weight, expecting to steady himself against substantial heft, but instead found the casket shockingly light. Too light. His glance toward the others was brief but sharp. The other soldiers registered it, the grips tightening instinctively, hiding the reaction. Maybe grief playing trick. They adjusted and marched on, pretending not to notice. The ceremony continued, the script tightly followed. The chaplain's voice rose again, reciting a prepared prayer about loyalty, about sacrifice, about duty until death. The gathered veterans bowed their heads, though some, in the privacy of shadowed brows, took glances toward the flag-draped box, as if trying to pierce through the layers of wood and cloth with sheer force of will. Could it be real? Could Orion, that massive creature of sinew and heart, be lying so lightly within? When the time came for the final salutes, a silver-haired veteran limped forward. His cane tapped against the cobblestones in a deliberate rhythm, each step an act of sheer will. His name was Colonel Whitmore, a man who had once commanded missions that had shaped the fate of nations. Now his eyes, pale and lined with the weight of memories, locked onto the casket with a look that was both reverent and searching. He reached out a trembling hand to rest lightly on the flag, whispering something under his breath, perhaps a farewell, perhaps a prayer no one else would ever hear. At that exact moment, cutting through the sacred hush like a blade, came a bark, sharp, piercing, defiant. Heads snapped up, hands instinctively moved toward holsters. The crowd shifted uneasily. The bark came again, not from among them, not from the ceremonial speakers, not even from the procession behind them. It echoed from somewhere deeper in the cemetery, beyond the tombstones and the blackened branches, where the mist clung stubbornly to the earth. The colonel's hand jerked back from the flag as if burnt. Gasps threaded through the assembly, disbelieving. Dogs sometimes barked, of course it could have been any stray, any trick of acoustics. And yet, that bark, it wasn't random, it wasn't lost, it was calling. Major Carlyle faltered in his words. The honor guards exchanged looks, taut and confused. Somewhere near the chapel's side entrance, a woman dropped her folded program and didn't stoop to retrieve it. The chaplain hesitated only a fraction before resuming the service. Voice raised slightly as if sheer volume could beat back the chill that had just wrapped itself around every heart in attendance. But the damage was done. Something was wrong. The funeral continued in form, but not in spirit. Every prayer, every salute, every tear felt suspended as though the entire congregation was waiting, breath held, for something else to happen. Something inevitable. In the distance, faint but deliberate, the bark echoed a third time, and though not a single man there would admit it later, every soul at that funeral, from the youngest cadet to the battle-hardened generals, felt a sliver of something ancient and primal shudder down their spine. It was not over. It had never been over. And whatever had been buried, the silence following the third bark lingered long after the chaplain's final prayer had ended. As the honor guard filed back into their rigid lines, and the crowd shifted uneasily, Major Carlyle gestured for the next part of the ceremony to begin. The giant screen, previously draped with black silk, was unveiled with a soft mechanical whir. The projector flickered to life, casting a shimmering image onto the fabric as the light cut through the misty air. The tribute video started simply enough. A slow montage of Orion's earliest days. A small, eager pup bounding alongside a pair of black combat boots across dusty training fields. The background music somber but soaring, images shifted into sharper memories. Orion with his handler Sergeant Dawson during their first deployment. The dog's snout dusted with sand as explosions blossomed in the background. Orion weaving through ruins, nose to the ground, finding the unseen dangers where even the most experienced soldiers had failed. A ripple of emotion passed through the crowd as a sequence played showing Orion leaping into a convoy under fire, dragging a wounded soldier by his vest back to cover. There were murmurs, sniffles, clenched jaws among the attendees, the veterans' hands balling into fists against their sides in a silent show of respect. But as the video progressed, something subtle began to shift. The images grew darker. More hurried Orion pacing under floodlights during a night raid. Orion barking into the void at unseen enemies, his muscles tense, ears pinned. Then came the final clip. It was grainier, raw footage, likely taken from a body cam or handheld device. Orion stood in a clearing surrounded by thick jungle, panted heavily, his coat matted with sweat and grime. For a long moment he simply stood, looking around, every fiber of his body quivering with tension. Then, slowly, deliberately, Orion turned. His head pivoted toward the camera, and he stared. Not just a glance, not a fleeting acknowledgement. His amber eyes locked onto the lens, and by extension, every soul watching. There was something impossibly human in that gaze. A message unspoken, a plea unfinished. It was not farewell, it was warning. A chill passed through the crowd. The screen faded to black. For a few beats, no one moved, no one breathed. It was Colonel Whitmore who finally broke the paralysis. His cane tapped against the stone once, twice, a sharp punctuation in the air. "You need to say something," he rasped, his voice a mixture of gravel and smoke. All eyes turned toward him, the ceremony's tight script forgotten. Whitmore straightened as much as his body would allow and faced the gathered assembly, the younger soldiers parting instinctively to give him room. "Last night," he began, pausing as if gathering the courage to continue. "I had a dream, not the kind born from bourbon or fatigue, the kind that feels like a summons." His gaze hardened, slicing through the crowd like a blade. He saw Orion, not lying dead, not fading away into some hero's afterlife. I saw him digging, his paws tearing at the earth, blood soaking into the dirt with every frantic swipe. Murmurs rippled outward like shockwaves. Some scoffed quietly under their breath, clinging to logic, to decorum. But others shifted uneasily, remembering the barks that had shattered the silence earlier. Whitmore pressed on. He was trying to uncover something, things buried deep and foul, and he wasn't just digging for himself. He was fighting. For us. The clouds overhead thickened, pressing the world into dimmer grays. The Major attempted to regain control, clearing his throat and stepping forward with his hands raised in a placating gesture. But even he lacked the conviction to dismiss what had just been said. Dreams were dreams, but in the world of soldiers, especially those who had danced so often with death, dreams sometimes carried weight. They sometimes bore messages too raw for waking minds to accept. Somewhere toward the back, a young corporal whispered to his comrade, "What if he's not really dead?" The words were barely audible, but in the unnerving quiet that had swallowed the funeral, they carried like cannon fire. Sergeant Dawson, Orion's last handler, bowed his head, his fists clenching around the worn leash he still carried coiled at his side, fingers trembling ever so slightly. The major, sensing the situation slipping further from control, ordered the honor guard to prepare for the ceremonial firing of rifles. The commands barked across the grounds in short, sharp bursts, but even those could not fully dispel the sense of invisible movement threading through the trees at the cemetery's edge, nor the lingering impression that Orion's story had not ended here. As the first volley cracked across the air, echoing into the hills beyond, several people involuntarily flinched, not from the noise, but from the sudden, unshakable certainty that somewhere, just beyond their sight, something stirred. Watching, waiting, the mist thickened, swirling at ground level in ghostly tendrils. The screen remained blank now, but in the hearts of all present, an image burned, amber eyes unwavering, calling them not to mourn, but to act. They had gathered to bury a hero. Instead, they had opened a door they could no longer close. The air was brittle with tension as the honor guard finished their rifle salute, the sharp retorts fading into a tense silence that clung to the funeral ground like an unwelcome mist. Somewhere high above, unseen crows circled the gray sky, their cries muted by distance. Major Carlyle signaled for the band to begin, their brass instruments gleaming coldly under the ashen light. The first mournful notes rose trembling into the air, a fragile melody stretched taut across a crowd whose minds were no longer anchored to the ceremony, but adrift in the unease stirred by the tribute video and Colonel Whitmore's dream. It happened during the second refrain. A sound not belonging to any instrument sliced through the music low at first, almost mistakable for a faulty amplifier or an errant gust of wind. But within seconds, it grew into something undeniable. A deep, guttural growl that rolled out from the forest edge beyond the cemetery walls. It wasn't the playful grumble of a restless pet, nor the territorial snarl of a feral dog. This was primal, ferocious, vibrating with such intensity that even the Bueller faltered mid-note, lowering his trumpet with a confused frown. Heads turned almost in unison toward the source, their movements mechanical, driven by instinct more than choice. The tree line remained still, the shadows deepening between twisted trunks and undergrowth, but the growl persisted steady, deliberate, and most chillingly incessant. Major Carlyle barked terse orders to the nearest lieutenants to check the perimeter, but none moved immediately. It was as if an invisible line had been drawn across the field, daring anyone foolish enough to cross. The band ceased playing altogether, their instruments drooping, their feet shuffling uncertainly against the gravel. The tension was a living thing now, coiling itself around every heart, squeezing breath from lungs and freezing muscle into rigid defiance against fear. Children clutched tighter to their mothers' skirts. Old veterans tightened their grips on canes and crutches. Some instinct, deep and ancient, told them to be still, to wait, to listen. Then, almost imperceptibly, the growl stopped. Silence rushed in to fill the void, deafening in its completeness. The major, trying to salvage order, commanded the casket detail to proceed with the folding of the flag. The honor guards moved robotically, their polished gloves trembling slightly as they pinched the corners of the flag and began the ritualistic folds. At that moment, Private First Class Donovan, the youngest of the casket guards, stumbled forward. His foot had caught on something slick near the base of the pedestal. Regaining his balance, Donovan glanced down, brow furrowing as he registered what he saw. His hand shot up in an instinctive signal, halting the fold ceremony mid-action. Several officers frowned in irritation, but Donovan didn't move, didn't speak. His eyes remained fixed on the ground surrounding the casket, a ground that by all logic should have been dry and unyielding under the week's clear skies. There, clear as if pressed into fresh mud, were a series of paw prints, large, distinct, wet. They circled the pedestal, overlapping and weaving, as if whatever had made them had prowled around the casket in tight, predatory loops. Donovan knelt slowly, ignoring the hissed commands to return to formation. He touched the nearest print with his fingertips. The earth was dry and cracked under his touch, but the print itself gleamed with moisture, leaving cold residue against his skin. He lifted his hand to his nose and inhaled sharply. It wasn't just water. There was a faint, metallic tang to it. A scent he recognized from battlefield triage zones and late-at-night veterinary tents in foreign deserts. The discovery spread through the formation like a virus. Soldiers shifting uneasily, some retreating half-steps, others gripping their sidearms with white-knuckled hands. Major Carlyle stormed toward the boy, his voice a low growl of its own, demanding to know the meaning of this disruption. But he faltered mid-stride as he saw the prince for himself. His mouth opened, then closed, the words dying on his tongue. Several senior officers exchanged glances, silent questions flashing between them. Could this be a prank? An attack? A message? The mist thickened once more, pooling low and clinging to the ground as if trying to hide the tracks, to swallow the evidence before too many could witness it. Donovan backed away from the casket, his eyes wide, his chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. A few of the older men, veterans of forgotten wars, made silent signs of the cross or whispered prayers under their breath. They knew the kind of knowing that comes not from rational thought, but from the primal, unfathomable places buried deep within the human soul, that this was no accident. Something had been here, something that should not have been. The major ordered the ceremony to continue, but the words rang hollow in the heavy air. As the honor guard resumed the folding of the flag, the band attempted to pick up the broken strains of taps, but no heart truly heard them. All attention remained anchored to the forest edge, to the still ignisable prints shimmering against dry earth, to the unseen presence that had growled at their intrusion and left its silent, bloody marks as testament. Private Donovan, unable to suppress the growing dread, muttered under his breath. He's not resting, he's still here. The flag, once crisp and proud in the guard's hands, now drooped slightly, edges dragging against gloved knuckles. As the final fold completed and the flag was prepared to be presented, a shiver passed through the ranks, subtle, collective, like a wind of fear moving unseen through their souls. And from deep within the woods, beyond the reach of their sight but not their senses, something shifted again, something, waiting. The flag was finally folded and placed atop the empty casket, but the ceremony had lost all meaning. The honor guards stiffened unnaturally, their every movement mechanical, brittle, as if a single wrong step might cause the delicate facade of order to shatter completely. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of things unspoken, as the mist began to coil higher, licking around boots and swirling near the pedestal like pale, searching fingers. The gathered mourners shifted restlessly, their heads turning not toward the speakers, but toward the dark line of trees beyond the cemetery's low stone wall. There, just beyond reach, something unseen but undeniable stirred. Major Carlyle tried to steady his voice, calling for the senior officers to stand at attention, but even he couldn't erase the tremor that danced along the edge of his words. Among the assembled crowd, whispers began to ripple, quiet at first, like the first tremors before an avalanche. Veterans who had seen too much death leaned into each other, their brows furrowed not with grief but with suspicion, with the gnawing certainty that something was very, very wrong. Private Donovan, still pale from his discovery of the wet paw prints, muttered something to the sergeant beside him, who responded only with a grim nod and a glance toward the forest. The ritual continued, but the spirit had fled. What remained was hollow, a performance meant to keep fear at bay. Then a voice cut through the hush, low, rough-edged, and laced with memory. He wasn't just a tracker, the voice said. It belonged to Sergeant Hawthorne, a man known more for his fists than his speeches, a veteran whose body bore the scars of wars fought in places that would never appear on maps. His voice was gravel scraping against stone as he pushed forward through the ranks, his chest heaving under the strain of words long kept buried. Orion wasn't trained for detection. He wasn't trained for rescue. Not just for that, he was trained for rescue. Not just for that, he was trained for... Murmurs rose again, louder now, edged with a growing hunger for truth. Hawthorne ignored the sharp looks from the officers, the warning glances begging him to stand down. His gaze was fixed somewhere distant, as if he could still see the jungles and deserts where he and Oriana had once stood together. Orion, Hawthorne said, his voice dropping to a growl, was trained to protect information, secrets, The kind of secrets that don't just change battles. They change governments, futures. A collective shudder rippled through the funeral gathering. A woman in civilian clothes gasped audibly, clutching her purse tighter. A young officer, too young to have served alongside Orion, but old enough to know what secrets in military context could mean, instinctively reached for the sidearm hidden beneath his jacket. The mist thickened further, swallowing the lower half of the soldier's legs, as if the earth itself sought to drag them into silence. Sergeant Hawthorne continued, his face carved from stone. He knew things. Places, codes, names, missions that could never be exposed. If Orion was ever compromised, he had protocols, extreme ones. He paused, his throat working as if the weight of those words threatened to choke him. The audience hung on the silence that followed, the reality settling like a stone in the gut. They were not merely burying a hero. They were standing at the crossroads of a cover-up that reached deeper and darker than any had imagined. Suddenly, from somewhere deep within the shifting mass of civilians, another voice broke the charged air. A whisper at first, barely audible, but slicing through the tension with surgical precision. The grave was empty, the voice said in Vietnamese, the words slipping through the crowd like a serpent. The grave is empty. Heads snapped toward the sound, but the speaker remained unseen, shielded by the throng of bodies and the growing mist. A second later, the whisper came again, this time in English, sharper, more urgent. Because Orion never died. A collective gasp raced through the assembly like a wildfire. Officers barked for order, hands reached for radios, and the honor guards instinctively tightened their formation around the casket. But the sense of control was already gone, shredded by the implications of that single, devastating sentence. Faces turned pale, jaws clenched. A woman in black heels stumbled backward, her hand pressed to her mouth as if to contain a scream. Orion, the hero they had come to bury, the legend they had come to honor, was not lying silent within the mahogany box. He was out there, somewhere, alive. The notion was madness, and yet no one could bring themselves to dismiss it. Not after the growl that had torn through the music, not after the bloody pawprints left in defiance of the sun-scorched ground. Major Carlyle barked into his radio, demanding immediate lockdown of the perimeter, his voice snapping like a whip. Armed guards began fanning out toward the cemetery's entrances, their movements swift but jittery, betraying the truth they refused to voice aloud. They were not prepared for what might come. Somewhere beyond the tree line, unseen eyes watched. The forest seemed to pulse with silent breath, every rustle of leaves and creak of branches magnified into thunder inside the skulls of the mourners. A low, almost inaudible growl stirred again, closer this time. The honor guard stepped back from the casket in unison, the polished flag quivering on the smooth wood. Sergeant Hawthorne clenched his fists until his massive stature "If Orion's alive," he said, voice tight with awe and terror. He's not coming for comfort. He's coming for the truth. The mist rose higher, curling in tight spirals around boots, weapons, gravestones. Somewhere near the rear of the cemetery, unseen but unstable, something massive moved between the tombstones, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. The funeral for Orion had turned into something else entirely. Not a farewell, a summons. The mist thickened until it obscured the ground in dense, swirling pools, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The officers barked frantic orders into their radios, calling for backup and surveillance drones, their words clipped and urgent. Major Carlyle ordered a full sweep of the cemetery, his voice straining to maintain authority as uncertainty and fear clawed at the edges of discipline. Soldiers and security personnel began spreading out in teams of two, weapons drawn, eyes darting between the shifting fog and the towering headstones. The atmosphere was electric, brittle, charged with a sense of imminent revelation. Somewhere beyond the veil of mist, the growl sounded again. Closer now, low and menacing, vibrating through the soles of their boots. Sergeant Hawthorne was the first to move with purpose, shoving past stunned mourners, his instincts burning through the shock. He barked for a portable scanner, demanding any tech that could help track heat signatures, motion, anything that could pierce the shroud around them. A corporal rushed forward with a tactical tablet linked to the nearest surveillance drone. The feed glitchy but serviceable. Hawthorne snatched it, his calloused fingers flying across the screen. Within seconds, a dozen blips populated the grid. Soldiers, civilians, known quantities. But there, near the southern edge of the cemetery where the ancient oak trees loomed like sentinels, a new blip pulsed steadily. It was small, no larger than a man, but it moved with an eerie deliberateness, weaving between the gravestones without any visible disturbance to the mist. Hawthorne's heart hammered against his ribs. A GPS signature, isolated, unknown, and it was moving. He flagged it immediately, relaying the coordinates to Major Carlyle, who dispatched a rapid response team toward the anomaly. The men moved in formation, weapons raised, their boots scuffing softly against the damp grass and gravel paths. Donovan was among them, his young face set into a mask of grim determination as he clutched his rifle close. As they advanced, the mist seemed to thin briefly, revealing the towering monuments and crumbling statues that populated the cemetery's neglected edges. The signal pulsed again, closer now. Suddenly, the ground trembled, not with an earthquake's raw violence, but a subtler, more insidious vibration, as if something massive was stirring deep beneath their feet. The lead scout stumbled, catching himself against a weather-worn greystone, and looked down in confusion. The soil beneath the stone was cracked, shifted, alive. Private Donovan caught a flicker of movement to his left, a flash of shadow, and swung his weapon toward it, but found nothing except a broken statue of an angel, its stone face weathered into an expression of eternal sorrow. He swallowed hard, sweat beading at his temple despite the chill in the air. The team pressed forward, guided by the tablet's blinking beacon, and then they found it, near the base of an ancient oak tree, half buried beneath creeping roots and overgrown ivy. A patch of disturbed earth caught Donovan's eye. He motioned for the team to halt, then dropped to one knee, brushing away the debris. His fingers struck cold metal beneath the soil. He froze, then cleared more dirt away, revealing a steel hatch, thick, reinforced. The GPS signal was emanating from directly beneath it. Major Carlyle arrived seconds later, breathless but composed, his sidearm drawn. He ordered the perimeter secured, barked for an engineer unit to breach the hatch, but even before they could begin their work, Donovan noticed something that made his blood run colder than the mist around him. Deep, gouged into the steel of the hatch were claw marks, massive, ragged, fresh, the scratches carved into the metal as if something had tried in sheer desperation or rage to tear its way free from the depths below. Donovan staggered back, bile rising in his throat. He had seen combat, had witnessed things that haunted his dreams, but nothing had ever prepared him for the raw, visceral terror that now gripped him. Someone or something had been trapped beneath them, had fought, and, judging by the state of the hatch, had not been human. Major Carlyle leaned in, inspecting the gouges with a grimace. He ran a gloved finger along one of the deeper furrows and brought it up to the light. Tiny flecks of dried blood and coarse hair clung stubbornly to the grooves. Carlyle's jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck twitching as he fought to keep control of the growing storm inside him. "We're opening it," he growled. The engineers moved with mechanical efficiency, setting charges designed for controlled breaches. The team pulled back to a safe distance, shielding themselves behind tombstones and statues, and at Carlyle's signal, the charges detonated with a muted thump, sending a plume of dirt and mist spiraling into the air. When the dust settled, the hatch hung ajar, its hinges twisted and blackened. A narrow staircase led downward into absolute darkness, the kind that seemed to swallow light whole. Carlyle ordered a team to descend, their flashlights piercing the gloom with thin, shaky beams. Donovan hesitated at the entrance, staring into that abyss, his mind screaming that whatever they were about to find, it would not offer answers they wanted to hear. And far below, deep in the dark, something shifted, waiting. The first steps into the hatchway were hesitant, cautious, every flashlight beam slicing into the suffocating blackness, only to reveal more shadow. The staircase groaned under the combined weight of the descending soldiers, each footstep echoing like a drumbeat of growing dread. Private Donovan gripped his rifle tighter, the skin along the back of his neck prickling as if unseen fingers trailed over his flesh. Beside him, Sergeant Hawthorne's jaw was clenched so tight it looked like it might shatter. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, the air grew colder, damper, carrying the faint metallic tang of old blood and rust. The floor leveled into a narrow corridor lined with reinforced concrete, the walls scarred and pitted as though from desperate claws or ancient explosions. Major Carlyle took point, his flashlight sweeping methodically across the walls, revealing remnants of old military stencils half erased by Time's serial numbers, warnings in bold black letters, orders that no longer mattered. They moved slowly, methodically, their boots crunching over debris, kicking up motes of dust that sparkled in the trembling light. At the far end of the corridor stood a steel door, slightly ajar, bent at the hinges in a way that suggested it had been forced open not from the outside, but from within. Donovan exchanged a glance with Hawthorne, both men reading the same thought in the other's eyes. Whatever had been contained here, whatever had once needed this level of security, it had broken free on its own terms. Carlyle approached the door cautiously, pushing it open with the barrel of his sidearm. The hinges screamed in protest, the sound ripping through the oppressive silence like a wounded animal. The room beyond was stark and clinical, illuminated only by their jittery beams of light. Metal lockers lined one wall, a bank of dusty monitors blinked dead and dark along another, and in the center of the room stood a heavy-duty kennel door, hanging open. Lock snapped clean, but it was what lay draped across a nearby examination table that drew their attention and froze them in place. A suit, a sleek, tactical bodysuit not designed for humans but for a canine. The material was a composite weave, layers of lightweight armor interlaced with circuits and microfibers. It had compartments for sensors, GPS, and what looked like hardened plates designed to absorb impact or resist attack. And the worst part, the suit was still warm to the touch. Private Donovan reached out, his hand hovering above the fabric before finally daring to brush the surface. He jerked back instantly, not from pain but from the unmistakable feeling of residual heat radiating from the suit, as if its wearer had only recently vacated it. The realization slammed into him like a sledgehammer. They weren't investigating a memory here. They were chasing something very much alive. Sergeant Hawthorne found his voice first, rasping low and grim. This wasn't a containment facility. It was an armory. Major Carlyle moved to the lockers, wrenching them open one by one. Inside were training manuals, encrypted data drives, surgical kits, and rows of injectable vials labeled only with coded designations. A few lockers appeared to have been ransacked from the inside, their contents scattered, claw marks gouged into the steel shelves. Carlyle's fingers brushed against something lodged between two fallen binders. He pulled it free, a slim leather dossier, battered but intact. Flipping it open under the beam of his flashlight, he found page after page of densely typed orders, surveillance images, performance metrics, all tied to a single designation: Orion. At the back of the file, a separate sheet of aged paper bore a red stamp that screamed classified across the top. Beneath that, in stark black ink, were only 6 words: Orion Final Protocol, Evasion and Extraction. Donovan leaned over his shoulder, reading the words aloud in a whisper that barely reached his own ears. Hawthorne swore under his breath, his mind racing faster than his lips could form the flood of questions threatening to spill out. Orion had not been left behind, he had been deployed. His disappearance wasn't a tragedy of war or a casualty of forgotten duty. It had been planned. Carlyle flipped deeper into the file, finding diagrams of escape routes mapped across continents, schedules for fake funerals to cover tracks, contingency plans for recovery or permanent silence. Orion's mission had not ended on a foreign battlefield. It had evolved, matured, and culminated in a ghost operation carried out not by men, but by the one asset no one would suspect, no one could trace. A dog, a weapon, a shadow unleashed. A sharp cry from one of the engineers snapped them out of their stunned stupor. Near the back of the room, partially hidden beneath a tarpaulin, another door had been discovered, not steel this time, but something older, heavier, reinforced with thick iron bands that bore the unmistakable scars of something battering it from the inside. The team regrouped, their earlier caution now replaced with grim urgency. Whatever was behind that second door had been left there for a reason, and now, the reason was clawing its way back into the world. The second door loomed ahead, its surface scarred with brutal gouges, iron bands warped and twisted from countless impacts. Major Carlyle ordered a breach team to prepare for forced entry, his voice tight with the tension of men standing too close to an unseen abyss. The engineers set their charges quickly, moving with the mechanical precision of soldiers too afraid to hesitate, their fingers working the detonators while their faces remained pale and grim under the anemic glow of their flashlights. The team retreated back toward the central corridor, taking cover behind overturned tables and shattered lockers, weapons raised, breaths shallow. Carlyle gave the signal, and with a muted thud, the explosives blew the door inward, showering the hallway with splinters of ancient wood and shards of iron. A wave of stale air rolled out from the darkness beyond, thick with the coppery tang of blood and the dry rot of long-forgotten secrets. For a moment, nothing moved. Only the whine of frayed hinges and the creak of settling debris filled the void. Carlyle motioned forward. The first two soldiers advanced, sweeping their lights into the breach, revealing a cavernous space beyond a chamber carved directly into the bedrock, its walls covered in flaking murals depicting strange experiments, esoteric symbols, and diagrams that hurt the eyes to look at too long. In the center of the room stood an empty harness mount, its restraints dangling uselessly, the ground below it scorched and scarred by claw marks. The team spread out cautiously, their movements careful, deliberate as they cataloged the horrors of the room. Shattered containment pods, deep scratches along the concrete, broken syringes and shattered vials crunching underfoot. The evidence was clear. Something had been imprisoned here and had left under its own power. Sergeant Hawthorne muttered under his breath, barely loud enough for even himself to hear. This wasn't a kennel. This was a lab. Private Donovan, still clutching the tactical tablet, monitored the GPS feed anxiously. The signal they had tracked had gone dead the moment the hatch had been breached, replaced by a dull static that made his teeth ache. Carlyle, sensing the escalating danger, gave the order to pull back, his instincts screaming that whatever answers lay here, they were not worth the price about to be paid. The soldiers began regrouping, moving back toward the entrance with quick, practiced efficiency. The last engineer packed away the remaining explosives, securing his gear with shaking hands. That was when it happened. Without warning, a shadow exploded from the darkness behind the ruined door, moving so fast it was little more than a blur to the naked eye. The team spun, weapons raised, but before they could fire, the creature halted, standing squarely in the middle of the corridor, illuminated by a dozen shaking flashlight beams. It was a beast shaped like a dog, massive, muscular, its sleek black coat rippling with barely contained energy. Its ears stood erect, its amber eyes locked onto the soldiers with a gaze so intense it rooted them to the spot. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. It was Orion. It had to be. The bearing, the poise, the unmistakable force of will radiating from the animal's body. Every instinct screamed recognition. Private Donovan took an involuntary step forward, his mouth opening to call out the name lodged in his throat. Orion. He breathed. The creature's ears twitched at the sound, but it did not move. Instead, it studied them with a frightening intelligence, its breathing steady, controlled. Then Sergeant Hawthorne, sharper than the rest even in his terror, saw it, the faint glimmer of a metal seam hidden just beneath the beast's fur at the base of its neck, the almost imperceptible pulse of synthetic musculature beneath the surface. Too perfect, too precise. He grabbed Donovan's arm, yanking him back violently. "That's not him," Hawthorne snarled, his voice filled with horror. The realization crashed over the team like a tidal wave. This was no simple animal. It was a copy, a fabrication, an engineered replica built for war, built for silence, built to replace the irreplaceable. The creature bared its teeth, not in a snarl of rage but in a grimace of calculated dominance, as if daring them to make the first move. Major Carlyle barked for them to hold their fire, his instincts screaming that a single wrong move would ignite something none of them were ready to face. Private Donovan's hands trembled as he lowered his weapon slightly, heart hammering in his ears. "It's waiting for something," he said hoarsely. From deep within the shadows behind the creature, another shape stirred, something larger, slower, dragging itself into view with the ponderous grace of inevitability. The replica took a single step forward, the ground trembling faintly under its weight, and then stopped, its gaze never leaving the soldiers. It wasn't here to attack. It was guarding something that had yet to emerge from the darkness. The soldiers stood frozen, their rifles half lowered, as the replica continued to block their retreat with calculated patience. its synthetic muscles tensing beneath the thin veneer of living tissue. Every instinct in their bodies screamed to run, to fight, but deeper than that, something older, something buried under layers of training and decorum whispered another truth, that violence would only spring the final trap. Sergeant Hawthorne shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing as he studied the scene with the battle-hardened cynicism of a man who had survived too many ambushes. "This isn't a containment," he muttered, his voice low, almost reverent. "This is a setup." His words cracked the dam holding back the rising tide of dread. Major Carlyle barked commands, ordering a tactical withdrawal. But the pathways they had come through, the stairwells, the corridors were no longer visible through the suffocating mist that now clung to the floor like a living thing, dense and impenetrable. Radios crackled with static, and the GPS feeds on their tablets blinked out one by one, leaving only dead screens and the distant echoes of their own panicked breathing. Private Donovan swung his rifle around frantically, searching for targets, for exits, for anything that wasn't the encroaching darkness or the ghostly sentinel of the Not Orient. "Sir," he gasped, "we're boxed in." And boxed in they were. From the shadows behind the replica, other figures emerged, men in tactical gear with no insignias, their faces hidden behind mirrored visors, moving with chilling precision. Their weapons were trained not on the synthetic beast but on the soldiers themselves. Major Carlyle realized it then, with a sinking hollowness in his gut. They had never been sent here to honor Oriana's memory or uncover the truth. They had been herded, maneuvered, played like pieces on a board they could not even see. And now the final move had come. Around him, the older veterans, Hawthorne, Lieutenant Vance, Canola Whitmore, understood too. Their postures shifted subtly, not in surrender but in preparation. The coiled readiness of men who had nothing left to lose. A voice crackled over a hidden loudspeaker, smooth, detached, cold as the grave. "You are not authorized to enter this facility. You have seen things you are not meant to see. Stand down and your families will be spared the consequences of your betrayal." The soldiers stiffened, rage simmering just beneath their skin. Carlyle raised his weapon slowly, his finger tightening on the trigger, but Hawthorne placed a hand on his shoulder, stopping him. "Wait," Hawthorne whispered, his voice hoarse with a different kind of urgency. "We need to know why." As if answering his demand, another figure was dragged into view by the masked operatives. A man, disheveled, battered, with blood crusted along his temple and wrists bound tightly behind his back. His uniform, though torn and filthy, bore the faded insignia of the very unit that had once trained Orion. Gasps rippled through the group. Major Carlyle stepped forward, recognition dawning on his face. "Captain Elroy," he said, voice trembling. Captain Elroy lifted his battered head, one eye swollen shut but the other burning with fierce, desperate clarity. His voice cracked from dehydration but carried across the cavern with the force of truth. "It was never about honoring Orion," he rasped. "It was about erasing him." The soldiers stared, stunned. Elroy continued, urgency lending him strength. "Orion found something during our last deployment. Files, communications, proof that high-ranking officers our own were selling intel, weapons, entire battalions to foreign powers." He coughed, a horrible rattling sound that made even the masked operatives shift uncomfortably. "He wasn't just a dog, he was a witness." Private Donovan's throat tightened painfully. "He's gone, isn't he?" Captain Elroy shook his head, the movement slight but full of defiance. "No, they tried to neutralize him. They created that." He jerked his chin toward the replica, to replace him, to cover the operation, but Orion escaped. "He's still out there." Sergeant Hawthorne gritted his teeth, fury boiling beneath his skin. "And they used us to lure him back." "You just lure him. Kill anyone left who knew the truth." The masked operatives began advancing slowly, weapons raised, their intent unmistakable. Carlyle raised his rifle again, his voice steady as he called out, "Weapons free." But even as the soldiers prepared to make their final stand, another sound ripped through the heavy silence, a low, resonant growl, ancient and powerful, vibrating through the stone beneath their feet. The replica turned its head sharply toward the darkness behind it, ears flattening against its skull, its body lowering into a wary crouch. The masked men hesitated, glancing toward the noise, uncertainty breaking their mechanical rhythm. And from the blackness beyond the broken door, Unseen but inexorably coming closer, something else approached, something real, something furious, something that had survived betrayal, manipulation, and death itself. Something that was not finished yet. The growl deepened, rolling through the cavernous chamber like the distant rumble of an approaching storm, freezing both soldiers and masked operatives alike where they stood, every muscle locked in a taut moment of impending violence. The replica canine, sensing the true threat, shifted backward a half-step, its synthetic eyes narrowing, its haunches coiled for flight not fight. Major Carlyle's breath caught in his throat as the darkness beyond the broken door churned and shifted, and then, with a suddenness that sent shockwaves through the room, a massive figure burst forth, moving low and fast, a blur of muscle, blood, and fury. Orion. The real Orion. Not the synthetic puppet crafted in sterile labs, not the ghost manufactured to deceive, but the living, breathing legend. Scarred and battered but unmistakably alive, his coat matted with blood and dirt, his left flank bearing a deep gash that oozed crimson with every powerful stride. He charged straight through the mist and wreckage, a thunderous presence impossible to ignore, his eyes burning with raw, intelligent fury. The replica, confused by the sudden emergence of its original, hesitated, and that moment's doubt was all Orion needed. With a savage snarl that echoed off the stone walls, Orion launched himself at the clone, the impact shaking the very ground as the two titans collided in a blur of teeth and rage. The soldiers, momentarily stunned, quickly found their resolve. Carlyle shouted orders to cover Orion, his voice hoarse but commanding, and the men opened fire on the masked operatives, their bullets slicing through the mist, tearing into the ranks of the hidden executioners. The enemy faltered, surprised by the sudden shift in momentum, their formations breaking as they scrambled to respond to the unexpected chaos. From the shadows behind Orion, more shapes materialized, not men but dogs, a pack of war canines, each one scarred by battle, each one wearing fragments of torn tactical gear, their movements disciplined yet feral, their loyalty absolute. These were not just strays or remnants, soldiers of flesh and blood abandoned by those who had once wielded them as weapons. Led by Orion, they surged into the fray, weaving between gunfire and smoke, sowing havoc among the masked operatives, disrupting formations, tearing down the facade of control that had so meticulously been constructed. Sergeant Hawthorne, rallying his men, fought with a fury born of betrayal, his rifle spitting fire as he carved a path toward the captive Captain Elroy, determined to free the man whose testimony could bring the entire rotten edifice crashing down. Amidst the chaos, Donovan spotted Orion staggering slightly, blood dripping from his wound but his movements unbroken, his determination a living force that pulled at the hearts of every soldier who saw him. And around his thick neck, half hidden by the grime and sweat of battle, something gleamed, a collar, battered and stained, but still intact, and fastened to it a small, waterproof pouch. Realizing its importance, Donovan sprinted forward, ducking under wild gunfire, leaping over fallen bodies, until he reached Orion's side. The great dog turned his head, fixing Donovan with a gaze so intense it pinned him in place, and for a moment, the young private swore he could hear the unspoken command echoing in his mind. "Take it." With trembling hands, Donovan unclipped the pouch and ripped it open, revealing a single folded document, laminated and sealed, the paper inside covered in dense text and official seals that made his blood run cold. Carlyle, fighting his way toward them, saw the packet and barked out, "Give it here." Donovan tossed it to him, and the major snatched it from the air, tearing the seal open and scanning the contents in the flickering light of muzzle flashes and burning debris. His face blanched as he read, the blood draining from his cheeks, his hands trembling. The document was no mere mission report. It was a ledger, a record of treasonous transactions. Names, dates, bank accounts, weapons shipments routed through shell companies, orders signed in blood and greed by generals, politicians, and corporate magnates whose faces adorned recruitment posters and news broadcasts. At the bottom of the page, scrawled in a hand Carlyle recognized with sickening certainty, were the final words, "Authorization for a Thorian, Kagan's proof, unshakable, undeniable proof, enough to bring down not just a few rogue agents but the entire upper echelon of command, to burn the cancer out by its roots." Sergeant Hawthorne reached them, blood streaking his cheek, his rifle held in one hand, his eyes wide as he saw the truth laid bare in Carlyle's shaking grasp. "We have to get it out," he rasped. "We have to show the world." Orion, though wounded and bleeding, pressed his massive body against Donovan's leg for a brief moment, a silent pledge of solidarity and defiance. Then, with a heaving breath, he turned and barked sharply, a command that cut through the chaos with undeniable authority. The other dogs responded instantly, forming a loose perimeter around the soldiers, snarling and snapping at the retreating masked operatives, herding the survivors toward the breached stairwell. Carlyle tucked the damning document into his vest, snapping orders for a fighting withdrawal, every instinct screaming that they had mere minutes to escape before reinforcements or worse arrived to seal their fate permanently. The soldiers, veterans, and hounds moved as one, a living, breathing organism forged in betrayal and bound now by a singular purpose: survive. Behind them, the synthetic replica stirred weakly, its systems sparking and failing, its false heart flickering into darkness as Orion led the real warriors into the dying light of the storm above. The battered group emerged from the ruined depths of the cemetery, just as the first light of dawn clawed its way through the dissipating mist, bloodied but unbroken, their breaths heaving in the cold morning air, their eyes wide and shining with a fierce, unyielding clarity. Behind them, the hidden bunker lay in ruins, smoke curling from the shattered hatchway as if the earth itself exhaled the poisoned secrets it had been forced to harbor for too long. Major Carlyle, clutching the damning documents to his chest, exchanged a grim nod with Sergeant Hawthorne and Captain Elroy, the silent agreement passing between them like a flame. There could be no return to the old world, no submission to the machine that had so callously discarded them and betrayed everything they had sworn to protect. They moved swiftly, ghosting through the skeletal remains of the funeral assembly, bypassing abandoned vehicles and scattered remnants of the crowd that had fled in terror when the battle erupted, every step carrying them farther from the graves of the old lies and closer to the uncertain future they had no choice but to seize. In the weeks that followed, the world reeled from the impact of the revelations. The documents smuggled out by Carlyle and verified through encrypted channels ignited a firestorm that no amount of political maneuvering could contain. News anchors stumbled over the sheer magnitude of the betrayal, as names once spoken with reverence became synonymous with treachery and disgrace. Arrests rippled through the highest ranks of military command and government, sweeping away those who had bartered honor for power, exposing networks that had operated in the shadows for decades. And yet, through all the upheaval, one figure remained conspicuously absent from the public stage: Orion. The government, desperate to save face, attempted to spin the narrative, painting the rogue war dog as a relic of a bygone era, an anomaly best forgotten, but the truth had already taken root, deeper and stronger than any bureaucratic whitewash could hope to uproot. Orion had become more than a soldier, more than a martyr. He had become a symbol, a living testament to loyalty that no corruption could extinguish. A month after the purge, in a reclaimed square once tainted by the weight of falsehoods, a new ceremony was held. The black banners of mourning now bore not the names of fallen heroes, but the faces of the condemned, the traitors exposed for their crimes against their own people. The flag that had once draped an empty coffin now covered a tribunal's podium, and the soldiers who gathered this time did so not in grief, but in grim satisfaction. They honored not the powerful but the betrayed. They wept not for the mighty fallen, but for the innocents stolen by their greed. In the shadow of that square, hidden from the cameras and the crowds, a different gathering took place. Orion stood atop a low hill, his frame still bearing the scars of battle, his breath misting in the cool evening air. Around him, his brothers and sisters, the pack of forgotten warriors assembled, their patient Pathians gathered at a range. Donovan knelt before Orion, fastening a new collar around the great dog's neck, not a symbol of ownership, but a badge of freedom. A simple band engraved with a single word: valor. Major Carlyle, Captain Elroy, and Sergeant Hawthorne stood nearby, their hands resting lightly on the worn straps of their gear, their faces solemn but determined. They knew they could not stay, not here, not where politics would eventually soil even this fragile victory. Orion turned his head, surveying his soldiers, his eyes flickering with a fierce, indomitable pride. He gave a low bark, sharp and decisive, and the pack stirred, muscles rippling, paws without another sound they moved. A living river of purpose flowing away from the ruins of old betrayals, surging toward the open plains and the dark line of the distant mountains. They ran not as fugitives but as vanguards of a new war, one not fought for empires or flags, but for truth, for loyalty, for the simple, unbreakable bond between those who refuse to be broken. The last light of day caught them as they crossed the borderlands, their silhouettes etched against the burning horizon. Dogs and men, equals now, bound by something deeper than orders or duty. A new dawn waited beyond the ridgeline, fierce and untamed, and they met it with open eyes and unbowed hearts. Orion, limping but unyielding, led them forward, his form gleaming like a shard of midnight steel against the rising fire of the sky. And somewhere in the swirling wind, carried on the wings of the coming storm, the world heard a sound it would never forget, a howl low and defiant, declaring that though the old world had crumbled, something purer had survived it, something that would never, ever kneel again. If this story moved you even a little, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay with us for more journeys like this. I would love to hear your thoughts. Which moment hit you the hardest? Where are you watching from today? Leave a comment below. Your voice matters here.